Pilot demands black girl be removed from cabin. She's the daughter of the airline's CEO. In a world where respect is meant to transcend borders and barriers, sometimes the darkest corners of human prejudice emerge at the most unexpected moments. Today, we bring you a riveting story that unfolded on Flight 817, bound for Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. A flight that seemed routine suddenly spiraled into a full-blown drama when a pilot demanded a young black girl be removed from the cabin. Unbeknownst to him, this child was no ordinary passenger. She was the daughter of the airline's CEO. Strap in for a jaw-dropping journey of shocking bias, hidden motives, and unbelievable twists that will leave you speechless. Danielle White's heels clicked lightly on the polished airport tiles as she guided her daughter, Aaliyah, through the bustling concourse of JFK International Airport. The mother and daughter duo had an air of excitement about them. This was not just any flight. It was Aaliyah's first chance to travel alone with her mother on an official trip for Skynova Airlines, the company that Danielle's husband, Jonathan White, had built from a single-route regional carrier into a respected, mid-sized airline with international flights. 11-year-old Aaliyah's dark, curly hair bounced in a ponytail as she tried to match her mother's brisk pace. She clutched a small pastel backpack with a sewn-on patch reading Bright Futures, a youth leadership organization she cherished. Her inquisitive eyes sparkled with eagerness and just a touch of apprehension. After all, she was used to traveling in the comfort of her father's company jet or on a commercial flight's premium cabin, but never quite in such a low-key manner. Jonathan and Danielle had insisted that Aaliyah experience life with fewer privileges sometimes, so she wouldn't grow up entitled or oblivious to how the real world functioned. This trip was Danielle's idea. She had a scheduled meeting with the marketing department in Atlanta, where Skynova was hosting a corporate event at its main hub, Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. Danielle often represented her husband at corporate gatherings, ensuring that the White family stayed personally involved in the airline's everyday affairs. As they made their way toward the gate, Danielle noticed a pilot in uniform standing off to the side, engaged in a hushed but animated conversation on his phone. The pilot's name was Captain Raymond Ray Parker. Tall, confident, and impeccably groomed, he was known among his peers for his unwavering dedication to flight safety and punctuality. However, those who worked closer to him sometimes whispered about his occasionally rigid and old-fashioned attitudes. Word around the crew lounges was that he had some deeply set biases he tried to keep hidden behind a veneer of professionalism. It wasn't something you could easily prove in direct conversation, but flight attendants who were women or people of color had picked up on an undercurrent of discomfort or hostility he exuded. Danielle paid him little attention beyond a polite nod, and he responded with a curt inclination of the head before refocusing on his phone call. Aaliyah scrunched her nose as they passed him, feeling a chill she couldn't explain. She was sensitive to subtle cues, an ability that sometimes shocked her parents. Despite the pilot's vaguely frosty greeting, mother and daughter pressed on, excited for the flight. Danielle had a strong desire for Aaliyah to be exposed to more of the airline's day-to-day business, especially in Atlanta, where Skynova's presence was largest. They had no idea that, over the next few hours, this flight would become an unforgettable turning point in all their lives. Once at the gate, Danielle and Aaliyah situated themselves near the seating area. They were supposed to board a Boeing 737-1 of Skynova's main workhorse aircraft, which held special sentiment for Jonathan White. He had negotiated the airline's first major Boeing purchase many years ago, at a time when people doubted a young, black entrepreneur's ability to break into the fiercely competitive aviation industry. Aaliyah couldn't help but stare wide-eyed at the window, watching the ground crews move baggage carts around, fueling the plane and prepping it for the trip. "Mom, can we go watch closer?" she asked. She had a fascination with the everyday operations of an airplane. Danielle smiled. "We can, sweetheart, but we need to stay within earshot of the gate announcements." Just then, Captain Parker appeared at the service desk. His phone call apparently concluded. He surveyed the gate area methodically. Something about his gaze made Danielle's heart quicken slightly, but she brushed it aside. As he turned away from the desk, he made direct eye contact with Danielle. Neither of them offered a smile. In the pilot's stare, Danielle caught a flicker of unease, perhaps. Hostility, even. She wasn't entirely sure. When it came time to board, first class and special assistance passengers were called. Danielle had arranged business class seats, but not the very front cabin, wanting Aaliyah to see how the airline's standard premium class worked. The mother-daughter pair stood, collecting their belongings. As they stepped forward, the gate agent, an older woman wearing a standard Skynova uniform, scanned their boarding passes and gave them a friendly greeting. "I see you two are traveling to Atlanta for the big event," the agent remarked. "That's quite exciting," Danielle responded. "Yes, it definitely is. My daughter is eager to see the operations in the main hub." "Good for her," the agent replied with a nod. "Enjoy your flight." Aaliyah beamed as they walked into the jet bridge. She loved the moment you stepped aboard, took those few steps from airport chaos to the cozy bustle of an airplane's cabin. Danielle's mind drifted to her husband. Jonathan was already in Atlanta, tying up some final details for the event. She was proud of the man he'd become, an example for those who dared to dream big, no matter their background. They were greeted by a petite, cheerful flight attendant named Clara, who welcomed them warmly. "Welcome aboard, ladies," she said, flashing a bright smile. "Let me help you find your seats." Clara guided them a few rows in. Their seats were on the left side of the cabin, near the aisle for Danielle and a window seat for Aaliyah. The overhead bins were still mostly empty, so Danielle had no trouble stowing their carry-ons. Once seated, Aaliyah pressed her face against the window to watch more of the loading process on the tarmac. Meanwhile, Danielle buckled up and took a moment to relax. She planned to catch up on some reading for the meeting. The cabin soon filled with the usual mix of business travelers, families, and individuals. The overhead announcements chimed, directing passengers to find their seats swiftly for an on-time departure. Captain Parker's voice sounded over the intercom. He introduced himself, the first officer, and welcomed everyone aboard with a perfunctory politeness that lacked warmth. Danielle thought nothing of it. Many pilots had that steady, almost emotionless tone. It was part of the job, right? Just as the flight attendants began their safety demonstration, Danielle noticed Captain Parker step out of the cockpit into the front part of the cabin. It wasn't unusual for a captain to briefly check something in the cabin before departure, but the expression on his face was clouded. He walked down the aisle as if scanning every row. For a moment, his eyes zeroed in on Aaliyah, who was excitedly pointing out the window at a baggage cart moving away. He moved closer. The flight attendant, Clara, paused in her safety demonstration, momentarily distracted by the pilot's unusual presence. Passengers began to murmur. Captain Parker stopped at Danielle's row. "Excuse me," he said, looking directly at Danielle but glancing occasionally at Aaliyah. "Ma'am, may I see your boarding passes?" Danielle looked up, genuinely puzzled. "Yes, of course. Is there something wrong?" Without responding, he took the boarding passes from her hand and examined them. His brow furrowed and he pursed his lips. "This is a business class seat assignment," he commented, as if stating an accusation. Danielle nodded slowly. "Yes, that's correct." He glanced again at Aaliyah. "We have certain protocols for unaccompanied minors. It appears you've booked a minor in a premium class seat." A hush fell over the surrounding rows of passengers. The pilot's tone was oddly confrontational, unlike the usual courtesy extended to any passenger, much less a well-paying one. Danielle didn't like where this was heading. She could feel a tension building, a tension she suspected was not rooted in any official airline protocol. "She's traveling with me," Danielle said evenly. "I'm her mother." Captain Parker gave a thin, forced smile. "I see." He then focused his attention fully on Aaliyah. "Young lady, are you comfortable here?" he asked, in a tone that struck Danielle as patronizing. Aaliyah looked at her mother, unsure how to respond. Yes, I am." "Why?" Captain Parker's gaze flicked back to Danielle. "We have reason to believe that sometimes seats get mixed up, or individuals try to, shall we say, move themselves into premium cabins without the proper ticket." Danielle felt the blood rush to her face. She forced herself to remain calm. "You just verified our boarding passes," she said, controlling her voice. "Everything is in order, correct?" Clara, the flight attendant, cleared her throat, stepping in. "Captain, is there an issue I need to address? I verified these passengers' seat assignments when they boarded." "It's fine," he said, handing the boarding passes back to Danielle. He paused, as if there was more he wanted to say, but the hush in the cabin grew more conspicuous. Another flight attendant signaled that they were behind schedule for the safety demonstration. With that, Captain Parker nodded curtly. "Yes, carry on." He walked back down the aisle toward the cockpit, leaving Danielle and Aaliyah rattled. "Mom," whispered Aaliyah, "did we do something wrong?" "No, sweetheart." Danielle shook her head gently. "I'm sure it's just a misunderstanding." Yet inside, Danielle's stomach churned. She sensed that the pilot's scrutiny was not merely about a mixed seat concern. It felt uncomfortably personal. Meanwhile, a few passengers around them exchanged nervous glances. A tall man in the row behind them leaned forward. "Excuse me, ma'am," he whispered. "I've flown with Skynova many times." "I've never seen a pilot interrogate a passenger like that." Danielle offered a tight smile. "I appreciate your concern. I'm sure everything's fine," but she wasn't entirely convinced herself. Shortly after the unusual confrontation, the safety demonstration resumed and the flight prepared for takeoff. Aaliyah eagerly peered out the window as the Boeing 737 taxied onto the runway. Danielle took a deep breath and tried to calm her nerves. "Just get through this flight," she told herself. "We'll land soon, and you can focus on the meeting in Atlanta." Still, the pilot's demeanor lingered in her thoughts. Danielle had a nagging intuition that the tension was not over, and she was right. Once airborne, the flight attendants began their usual routine of passing out beverages and snacks to business-class passengers. Despite the hustle and bustle in the cabin, Danielle noticed that Captain Parker made repeated announcements more than usual about security protocols, cabin compliance, and how any violation would result in immediate intervention. His tone was strict, almost threatening. Passengers cast uncertain looks at each other. At one point, Clara stopped by Danielle's row, offering a warm smile to Aaliyah. "Would you like orange juice or apple juice, dear?" she asked. Aaliyah smiled back. "Apple juice, please." Clara poured the drink into a small plastic cup and handed it over. "Here you go." "And for you, ma'am." "Water is fine, thank you," Danielle replied. Clara looked around, then leaned in slightly. "I'm so sorry about earlier," she whispered. "I'm not entirely sure why Captain Parker was being so direct. I'll make sure you and your daughter have a pleasant flight." "We appreciate that," Danielle said, giving Clara a grateful nod. The woman behind Danielle, a middle-aged mother traveling with 2 children of her own, reached over and touched Danielle's shoulder lightly. "I've been a passenger on flights with that pilot before," she murmured. "He wasn't exactly friendly then either, but this time something feels off." Danielle struggled to smile. "Thank you for your concern. I'm sure we'll be fine." She tried to dismiss her own concerns, but they refused to fade away. She decided to check her phone, though she knew in-flight connectivity might be spotty. Still, she had important notes for the upcoming meeting to review. As she powered up her tablet, Aaliyah tapped her mother's arm. "Look, Mom, we're over the clouds now. It's like a giant blanket." Danielle looked through the window, letting the serene view calm her for a moment. "Beautiful," she agreed softly. "I love this view." No sooner had she relaxed than Captain Parker's voice filled the cabin again. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking," he began. "We're expecting some moderate turbulence ahead, so please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." Flight attendants scurried to secure the cabin. Danielle fastened her belt, double-checking Aaliyah's. A slight jolt shook the airplane, then another. It was indeed moderate turbulence, but nothing too severe. After several minutes it settled down. Yet, for reasons unknown, Captain Parker decided to keep the seatbelt sign on for an unusually long period. Passengers were getting restless, especially those who needed to use the lavatory. Finally, the seatbelt sign flicked off, and there was a small rush of people heading for the aisle. Just as everything seemed to settle, Captain Parker emerged from the cockpit once again. This time, he bypassed the first few rows and walked directly to Danielle's seat. "You," he said, pointing at Aaliyah. His tone was clipped. "Did you leave your seat when the sign was on?" Aaliyah blinked, startled. "No, sir. I stayed seated." She glanced at her mother, confusion clouding her young face. Danielle's voice hardened. "What is this about, Captain?" "My daughter has not moved from her seat." He placed his hands on his hips, shooting a glare at Danielle. "We take safety very seriously on this aircraft." "So does my daughter," Danielle snapped, her patience fraying. She forced herself to adopt a calmer tone. "Sir, is there an actual issue here? Because if not, I'd appreciate it if you let us continue our flight in peace." Passengers were now openly watching, some leaning into the aisle to see what was happening. The tension in the cabin was palpable. Clara quickly approached. "Captain, is everything all right?" Captain Parker turned to Clara, jaw tight. "If we have a passenger violating seat belt protocols, that's my business." "Again, Captain," Danielle interjected, maintaining forced composure. "My daughter did not leave her seat during the turbulence. You can check with everyone around us." The pilot stared at Danielle for a moment that stretched uncomfortably. "Fine," he said eventually. "I will be keeping an eye on this row." He turned on his heel and retreated to the cockpit, leaving behind a hush of disbelief. Tears shimmered in Aaliyah's eyes. She felt singled out and confused. "Mom, why does he keep picking on me?" she whispered. Danielle took a steadying breath, wrapping an arm around her daughter. "I don't know, sweetie, but you've done nothing wrong." As the flight continued, Danielle found it nearly impossible to concentrate on her reading. The pilot's behavior wasn't just heavy-handed, it felt personal, specifically directed at Aaliyah. And Danielle had a suspicion why. She remembered how her husband, Jonathan White, had faced bigotry in his journey to build Skynova Airlines. There had been more than a few skeptics who didn't believe a black CEO could successfully run an airline. Could Captain Parker be one of those voices who had hidden behind a corporate facade for years, harboring resentment at the very top? She wasn't certain, but she couldn't ignore the possibility. Danielle cast her thoughts back to Jonathan's early days in the airline business, a time when banks refused loans, investors doubted his vision, and established competitors saw him as an unwelcomed upstart. Yet Jonathan's persistence and brilliance led him to start small, a single-used turboprop plane running short commuter routes around a few southeastern cities. Over time, strategic partnerships and unwavering dedication helped him build the brand. Now, Skynova was a respectable, thriving airline with a strong presence at multiple major airports, including Atlanta. With success also came internal politics, old guard pilots and staff, who sometimes resented that their new boss was a man who, in their eyes, didn't fit the traditional mold of airline leadership. Jonathan, never one to flaunt power, had treated employees with respect, hoping to win them over with fairness and vision. Some hearts and minds changed. Others only pretended to follow along, biding their time. Now, Danielle wondered if Captain Parker was one of those who never truly accepted that the man in charge of their paychecks, equipment, and flight schedules was someone they considered outsider stock. And now, apparently, that pilot was extending his bias to Danielle's daughter. "How far is it to Atlanta?" Aaliyah asked softly, pulling Danielle out of her thoughts. "Not too much longer, sweetheart," Danielle said gently. "We'll be landing in about 2 hours." In the seat across the aisle, a corporate executive from another company was peering at them with sympathetic eyes. "It's atrocious how he's treating you," the executive murmured. "If you need a witness to anything, let me know. My name is Greg Larson." He handed Danielle a business card. "Thank you, Mr. Larson," Danielle said. "I appreciate that." She resolved that if the pilot overstepped again, she would handle it more forcefully. For now, though, she needed to keep Aaliyah calm. The next half hour passed relatively peacefully, despite the uneasy atmosphere. Aaliyah quietly played with a puzzle game on the seat back screen, while Danielle tried to focus on her meeting notes. Clara brought them a small lunch, salads and a bread roll. They attempted to enjoy the meal, but Captain Parker's presence loomed in the background. Suddenly, the seatbelt sign chimed on again. Captain Parker's voice announced fresh turbulence. However, the cabin itself was stable. No one felt any shaking. Passengers exchanged puzzled looks. Some were already returning from the lavatories when the sign came on, and flight attendants began urging them to sit. Moments later, Captain Parker stormed back into the cabin, catching a flight attendant mid-aisle. He scolded her in front of everyone for not ensuring every passenger was seated the instant the sign illuminated. The flight attendant, looking alarmed, tried to explain that the announcement and the sign came without warning, and it wasn't possible to instantly force everyone down. At that moment, Aaliyah raised her hand to get Clara's attention. She needed to use the restroom. Clara, sensing an impending confrontation, tried to intervene. "Captain," she said, "I will make sure the young passenger here returns to her seat as soon as possible. It's an urgent matter." "You do no such thing," the captain barked. "The seat belt sign is on." She stays seated. Aaliyah's eyes filled with tears of discomfort and embarrassment. Danielle stood up, her face taut with anger. She is a child who urgently needs the restroom. "We're stable at the moment. This is not actual turbulence, is it?" Captain Parker whipped around, eyes blazing. "Are you questioning my authority on this aircraft?" Danielle refused to back down. "I'm questioning the motives behind your arbitrary commands." A hush fell over the surrounding rows. Passengers stared, some aghast, some outraged on Danielle's behalf. A low murmur began to ripple as more and more people caught wind of what was happening. Clara stepped in again, her voice calmer. "Captain, I can supervise the girl. It will only take a moment." "No," he repeated tersely. Then, turning on Danielle, he demanded, "You sit down now." In that charged moment, Danielle had had enough. "Sir," she said with a firmness that caught everyone's attention, "I don't know what your problem is, but your behavior is out of line. My daughter is simply a passenger who needs to use the facilities. She is not a threat. If the plane is not actually in turbulence, keeping her from the restroom is not only cruel, but also potentially harmful." Captain Parker's face reddened. His lips trembled as though he was restraining a heated retort. Then, in an icy, measured tone, he said, "Fine, but if anything happens, it's on you, and be quick about it." Clara gently guided Aaliyah to the nearest lavatory. Danielle stood frozen for a moment, adrenaline coursing through her as the pilot stared her down. "You are dangerously close to interfering with crew instructions," Captain Parker warned. Some passengers gasped. A few took out their phones, quietly beginning to film. Danielle exhaled slowly, meeting the pilot's glare without flinching. "I am well aware of the regulations. Now, if you're done harassing my family, I'd like to return to my seat." He muttered something under his breath too low for Danielle to catch, then turned and stalked back to the cockpit. Minutes later, Clara returned with Alia, who slipped back into her seat, visibly shaken. Danielle comforted her daughter, whispering reassurances in her ear. But inside, Danielle was seething. She vowed that once this flight landed, she would take immediate action. She might be the CEO's wife, but she had her own share of authority, and she would not stand for such blatant harassment. The altercation had galvanized several passengers, who whispered among themselves. A middle-aged black couple across the aisle gave Danielle empathetic looks. One of them, a gentleman named Harold, leaned over. "We've got your back," he whispered. "I've never seen anything like this from a Sky Nova pilot." Greg Larson, the executive from earlier, chimed in. "This is outrageous. I'm documenting everything. I can't believe this pilot's nerve." Clara resumed her duties, but she made it a point to stop by Danielle's row frequently, providing small comforts, extra napkins, refills, anything to show her support. Another flight attendant, a taller man named Eric, also lingered around, giving discreet nods of solidarity. Shortly afterward, Captain Parker made another announcement that they'd be starting their initial descent into Atlanta in about 45 minutes. His voice sounded tense, an undercurrent of barely contained anger, as though he was still bristling from the earlier confrontation. Meanwhile, Danielle felt a gnawing worry. If the pilot's hostility escalated, could he do something reckless? She prayed he would at least keep to professional standards of flight operation. After all, the safety of everyone on board was paramount, including his own. She leaned over to Alia, smoothing her daughter's hair. "We're almost there, honey. Just focus on something nice, like the aquarium we'll visit in Atlanta. Daddy wants to take us after the conference." Alia nodded, still subdued. "I love the whale sharks," she whispered. "They're so big." Danielle managed a small smile. "Yes, exactly. Think about that." As the plane continued its flight, the tension was like a visible fog in the cabin. Passengers kept glancing toward the cockpit door, half expecting Captain Parker to storm out again at any moment, but he stayed put, presumably preparing for the landing. When the seat belt sign came on yet again, Clara and Eric made final checks of the cabin, ensuring everyone was secured. Danielle noticed Clara approach the cockpit door, as though she wanted to say something to Captain Parker, but she hesitated, then turned away. As they descended, Danielle felt the usual popping in her ears. She clutched Alia's hand, determined that no matter what else happened on this flight, they would be safe. The Boeing 737 touched down with a bump on the runway at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. Relief coursed through Danielle, along with a simmering anger she'd carefully bottled up. "Almost there," she whispered to Alia. But just as the plane began to taxi toward the gate, a voice boomed over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Parker. I have a security concern that needs immediate attention. We will be holding on the tarmac until this issue is resolved." A wave of confusion and alarm swept through the cabin. The flight attendants looked at each other, baffled. Danielle's heart pounded. "What is he doing?" she thought. Clara rushed to the intercom at the front of the plane, speaking quietly. Danielle couldn't hear the exchange, but it looked tense. Then Clara made an announcement in a strained tone. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain in your seats with your seat belts fastened as we address an operational matter." Passengers grew restless. They'd landed, but they were not moving to the gate. A few asked flight attendants what was going on, but no one had a clear answer. Suddenly, 2 uniformed airport security officers boarded the plane. A murmur of disbelief rippled from the front row all the way back. The officers conferred with Captain Parker, who had stepped just outside the cockpit door. Then, to everyone's shock, the captain pointed directly at Danielle and Alia. "That's them," he said loudly. "I want them removed." Gasps filled the cabin. Danielle shot up from her seat, unbuckling. "What are you talking about?" she demanded. her voice trembling with anger. Aaliyah clutched her mother's arm, eyes wide in terror. One of the officers approached them, face conflicted. "Ma'am, we need you and your daughter to come with us." "This is insane," Danielle protested, fear and rage colliding inside her. "On what grounds?" Captain Parker stepped forward, brandishing a small notepad. "I have documented several violations of federal aviation regulations. They interfered with crew instructions, displayed disruptive behavior, and refused to comply with seatbelt sign protocols. I'm within my rights to remove them from the aircraft." Danielle's mouth fell open in disbelief. "That's a lie, and you know it." Passengers erupted into pandemonium. Shouts of "No, that's not true, and you can't do this," echoed through the cabin. Some brandished their phones, still recording. Greg Larson stood up. "Officer, I'm a witness. This pilot has been targeting them the entire flight. The child did nothing wrong." The black couple across the aisle also rose. "This is unacceptable. We've been watching the whole time. This is harassment." The security officers looked overwhelmed, uncertain whom to believe. Captain Parker continued to insist that Danielle and Aaliyah were unruly passengers. The flight attendants, Clara and Eric, rushed to intervene. Clara addressed the officers, her eyes flashing. "I can confirm these passengers did not violate safety rules. This is purely the captain's personal vendetta." Captain Parker's face twisted with fury. "Watch your mouth, flight attendant," he snapped. "You're only making it worse." One of the security officers held up a hand to calm the chaos. "Let's handle this in a more orderly fashion." "Ma'am," he said to Danielle, "please gather your belongings. We need to move this discussion off the aircraft." Danielle's emotions warred inside her. On the one hand, she didn't want to cause a scene that might scare Aaliyah further. On the other hand, the injustice was too blatant to ignore. But for Aaliyah's sake, she decided to comply for the moment. She grabbed their carry-ons from the overhead bin, her hands shaking with anger. Passengers booed and jeered at the pilot as Danielle and Aaliyah moved toward the exit. Some shouted supportive remarks. "We've got this on camera. We'll testify for you. This is discrimination." Aaliyah's eyes were glistening, and Danielle felt the heartbreak of her daughter's confusion. She whispered, "It's okay, baby. We'll clear this up, I promise." As she walked past Captain Parker, Danielle locked eyes with him. "You have no idea who we are," she said quietly, but there was steel in her voice. "You will regret this," he scoffed. "I doubt that," he hissed under his breath, turning away as they followed the security officers off the plane. The security officers led Danielle and Aaliyah into a corridor near the gate. By now, alarmed airport staff had gathered, trying to figure out why a recently landed flight was still stuck on the tarmac. The tension in the hallway was thick, but everything changed the moment a tall man in a well-tailored suit came sprinting down the hall. Jonathan White, the CEO of Skynova Airlines, and Danielle's husband, Aaliyah's father. Someone had texted him about a commotion involving Danielle and a child. Rumors flew quickly in airports, and Jonathan wasted no time rushing from his office in the terminal to see what was happening. "Danielle, Aaliyah," he called out, his face etched with worry. He reached them, pulling them both into a protective embrace. "Are you all right? What happened?" Aaliyah clung to him, tears spilling down her cheeks. Danielle's eyes brimmed, a tumult of relief and anger. "That pilot, Parker, he's been harassing Aaliyah the entire flight. Then he had us removed." Jonathan's eyes flashed with anger. His protective nature as a father, combined with his authority as CEO, surged. He turned to the security officers, who were still standing by, uncertain. "Officers, I'm Jonathan White, CEO of Skynova. Please explain why my wife and child have been escorted off their flight at my own airline." The officers exchanged stunned looks, scrambling to process the gravity of their predicament. One cleared his throat. "We, were called by the captain about a passenger issue," He claimed your family was being disruptive. Disruptive, Jonathan echoed, his voice dangerously low. I've already received a flood of texts and emails from passengers on that flight describing a gross abuse of authority by the captain. I'd like to see the footage from their phones. You, he said, pointing to a Sky Nova operations manager who had arrived, get me all relevant flight attendant statements, passenger statements, everything. The operations manager nodded briskly, scurrying off to fulfill the order. Jonathan guided Danielle and Aliyah to a nearby lounge area, sitting them down gently. Tell me everything. As Danielle recounted the events, tears threatened, but she kept her composure. She described how Captain Parker singled them out, tried to prevent Aliyah from using the restroom, and falsely accused them of violating safety regulations. Jonathan listened in silence, his face a storm of controlled rage and heartbreak. Aliyah chimed in about how scared she felt. How long have we known this Parker? Jonathan asked at one point. Danielle searched her memory. He's been with the airline for a few years, but I don't recall ever meeting him in person. He's apparently had some attitudes. Jonathan exhaled, his mind piecing together the puzzle. Sky Nova had grown so big that it was impossible for him to know every pilot personally. But the fact that Parker had singled out his daughter for some twisted reason, it was intolerable. Within minutes, a handful of flight attendants, including Clara and Eric, arrived to speak directly with Jonathan. Clara tearfully confirmed everything, detailing Captain Parker's aggressive manner and his laser-like focus on Aliyah. It was so inappropriate, she said, voice trembling. He was determined to make them out as trouble, even though they did nothing. Jonathan thanked them for their honesty, his voice quiet, but laced with urgency. We'll handle this, he assured them. Thank you for looking out for my family. Moments later, the operations manager hurried back, brandishing a tablet. Sir, we have several passenger video clips. They're quite damning. Jonathan watched them, shaking his head in disbelief at the pilot's behavior. Then his eyes narrowed, cold and resolute. I want Captain Parker brought here immediately, he told the manager. If that plane is still on the tarmac, I want him off it. Now. Meanwhile, the entire flight had finally pulled up to the gate. Passengers disembarked, some still recording, some vehemently discussing the fiasco. A small crowd formed in the corridor, exuding a restless energy. Airport staff tried to manage them, but the scandal was out in the open. As Danielle and Aliyah stood next to Jonathan, the corridor suddenly buzzed louder. Security escorted Captain Parker toward them. His expression was stiff with indignation, as if he still believed he could double down on his authority. Then he spotted Jonathan White, and a flicker of realization danced across his face. He seemed to lose a shade of color. You, Jonathan said, his voice carrying an air of absolute authority, are the one who ordered my wife and child off that aircraft. Captain Parker swallowed hard. ID, not no. They never informed me that. Jonathan cut him off. That she was my wife, and this child was my daughter. And that you demanded a black child be removed from the aircraft on completely fabricated charges. Does that sum it up? The pilot's jaw dropped, and his eyes darted to Danielle and Aliyah. His entire demeanor changed from overconfident to cornered. I was only following safety protocols, sir. Jonathan's voice was eerily calm. Safety protocols do not include singling out a young passenger for harassment, lying about seatbelt violations, or humiliating my family in front of an entire plane. I have multiple eyewitness accounts, including crew members, and video evidence. Captain Parker looked like a trapped animal. He tried to stammer a defense, but Jonathan held up a hand, silencing him. Effective immediately, you are suspended from duty, Jonathan said. We will launch a full investigation, and I assure you that your future employment at this airline is in grave jeopardy. Leave your ID badge and any airline property with the security officers. The pilot's face flushed with anger and shame. Mr. White, he began, but words failed him. Jonathan turned to the operations manager. Take him away and begin the formal process. Ensure he's removed from the premises. Security stepped forward, escorting a speechless Captain Parker away. The crowd watched in a mixture of satisfaction and awe. Some passengers cheered softly, the pilot's shoulders slumped, and the arrogance in his eyes drained out as he disappeared down the corridor. Once Captain Parker was gone, Jonathan knelt beside Aliyah, gently brushing away her tears. "I'm sorry, baby girl," he said softly. "You should never have gone through that." Aliyah's lip trembled. "He was so mean, Daddy, like he hated me." Pain flickered across Jonathan's face. "He was wrong, and I promise you, we'll make sure this never happens again." Passengers and staff lingered, offering words of support. Some patted Danielle and Aliyah on the back. Others told Jonathan how grateful they were for his swift action. Clara came up, tears in her eyes. "Thank you, Mr. White," she said. "We were all so upset. I hope we didn't overstep by trying to protect your family." "You did exactly what you were supposed to do," Jonathan replied, giving Clara a reassuring smile. "Standing up for what's right is never an overstep." Word traveled fast, as it always does in an airport. By the next day, headlines began popping up on social media. Pilot demands passenger removal, then learns she's the airline CEO's daughter. Skynova pilots suspended over racial harassment allegations and so forth. Passengers who had recorded the incident posted clips online, which quickly went viral. In the days that followed, Jonathan spearheaded a thorough investigation, reviewing Parker's history, checking if there had been prior complaints. It turned out there were subtle warnings and anecdotal accounts, mostly from flight attendants and a few minority passengers, but nothing had previously escalated to the level of official action. Now it was different. With undeniable evidence from Aliyah's flight, the airline's board convened. Captain Parker tried to defend himself, claiming he had no idea who Danielle and Aliyah were, that race had nothing to do with it, and that he had only followed standard procedures. But his repeated targeting of Aliyah, plus the contradictory statements from crew and passengers, made his defense ring hollow. When confronted, he became more agitated, revealing a personal grudge he had harbored since Jonathan White took over the airline. He believed that older, more traditional pilots were not respected enough, and that the new leadership favored diversity hires, pushing real aviators to the sidelines. His words only incriminated him further, exposing a deep bias that had driven him to single out Danielle and Aliyah. A week after the incident, the board voted unanimously to terminate Captain Parker's employment with Skynova. The final blow came from Jonathan, who stated unequivocally, "Anyone who cannot uphold the values of this airline's safety, respect, and dignity for all has no place in this company." Losing his pilot's job, Parker found himself blacklisted in the industry, at least in the short term, as word spread of his misconduct. He had once been considered a valuable pilot with a spotless record. Now, overshadowed by scandal, he struggled to find a new position anywhere. Rumors circulated that he might have to move to a much smaller regional operator that was desperate for experienced pilots, but even then, his reputation would precede him. Meanwhile, Jonathan and Danielle turned their attention to supporting Aliyah's emotional recovery. They explained in gentle terms that, sadly, some people let prejudice influence their actions, but that those actions do not define her or limit her potential. Aliyah threw herself into activities she loved, reading about airplanes, volunteering with Bright Futures, and writing short stories for school. In the broader public eye, the scandal drew attention to the ongoing challenges of racism and discrimination in the corporate world, even in industries that prided themselves on innovation and global reach. Jonathan, always an advocate for progress, leveraged the incident to launch a new pilot mentorship and diversity program within Skynova. The idea was not just to punish wrongdoing, but to cultivate a workforce that truly embraced equality and inclusion. As for Captain Parker, news trickled in that he had sunk into financial difficulties. Rumors swirled that he was fighting a lawsuit from some of the passengers who claimed emotional distress from his actions. Possibly faced with civil litigation, he had to pay hefty legal fees. Each day seemed to bring new challenges for the once proud pilot, a stark reminder of how hatred and ignorance could derail a career and life. In the months after the flight, Danielle noticed Aliyah gradually regaining her confidence. The outpouring of support from passengers, community leaders, and even strangers online had shown the young girl that, while bigotry exists, so does solidarity and compassion. One evening, the family sat around their living room, laughing as Aliyah described her upcoming science project about aerodynamics. Jonathan pretended to be her consultant, offering a mock business plan for her project's research budget. Danielle teased them both, saying she'd only invest if Aliyah promised a 50% ROI in the form of homemade cookies. Underneath the warmth of family banter, they all felt the gravity of what had happened. It was a turning point that tested their faith in the goodness of people and reaffirmed it in the end. Aliyah asked quietly, "Dad, do you think Captain Parker will ever be sorry for what he did?" Jonathan exchanged a glance with Danielle. "I don't know," he said softly. "Sometimes people realize their mistakes and change. Sometimes they don't. But what matters is how we continue to live our own lives. We show kindness, stand up for ourselves and others, and never let hatred win." The family fell silent for a moment, letting those words settle. Outside the window, the night sky stretched wide, reminiscent of the flight paths that connected cities, countries, and people. About a year later, Skynova held a celebration to mark the opening of a new training center near Atlanta, which offered scholarships to aspiring pilots from underrepresented backgrounds. Dignitaries attended, local press covered the event, and many employees brought their families. Jonathan stood at the podium to give the keynote speech. Danielle and Aliyah sat in the front row, beaming with pride. Camera flashes blinked across the stage as Jonathan spoke about the airline's journey, acknowledging both triumphs and setbacks. He didn't mention the scandal with Captain Parker explicitly, but everyone knew it had been a catalyst for change. "I believe in the power of the skies," Jonathan said, "because the skies can unite us, break down barriers, and show us horizons we never thought possible. May every flight bring us closer together, and may this training center help future pilots soar to new heights no matter where they come from or what they look like." Applause thundered. As Jonathan stepped down, Aliyah ran up to hug him. "Great speech, Dad," she said, her eyes shining. Danielle embraced them both, remembering the day not so long ago when they had tasted a bitter encounter with prejudice. Now, they channeled that pain into something hopeful, a place where children like Aliyah could learn to fly, literally and metaphorically, free from the chains of hatred. Later, as the crowd thinned, an older man approached quietly. He looked nervous. Danielle's heart skipped a beat. He resembled Captain Parker, but it wasn't him. It was one of Parker's longtime friends. The man cleared his throat. "Mr. White, Mrs. White, I just wanted to say I'm sorry about what happened that day. I flew with Ray for years. I never realized the depths of his prejudices until this all came out. Thank you for taking the stand you did. Honestly, it's forced a lot of us to reflect." Jonathan nodded, not unkindly. "I appreciate that." The man gave a small nod, then hurried away. The moment underscored how far the ripple effects of that one flight had spread. Back at their home, Aliyah rummaged through her closet and pulled out the pastel backpack she'd carried on the ill-fated flight 817. Inside was a small pamphlet about Bright Futures, the youth leadership group she adored. She traced the words with her finger and smiled, remembering how that flight had become a powerful lesson in standing up for oneself and others. She had come away from the experience with a deeper understanding of the world's complexities, bigotry, injustice, the importance of speaking out, and the capacity of human beings to rally in support of what's right. In some ways, it was a harsh education to receive at such a young age, but it also fueled her resolve. She wanted to make a difference, to help create a world where no one would ever feel the sting of prejudice in a place that should be welcoming, and so life moved forward. Aliyah went to school each day with new determination. Danielle continued assisting Jonathan in the airline's affairs, balancing motherhood and corporate responsibilities. Jonathan pressed on, championing equality and opportunities for all. They flew many more flights, none overshadowed by the ugliness of discrimination. As for Captain Parker, he faded into the background of aviation gossip. Some said he moved to another state, picking up odd piloting jobs or working a desk role for a tiny charter operation. The aviation world was surprisingly tight-knit. Once your reputation took a major hit, it was hard to recover. That one event where a pilot demanded a black girl be removed from the cabin, not knowing she was the daughter of Skynova's CEO, became a cautionary tale about arrogance, racism, and the dire consequences of letting one's bias run unchecked. Ultimately, in this story, justice was served, and for Aliyah, the sky remained limitless, untouched by the clouds of prejudice. That brings our story to a close, reminding us all that every decision we make, every word, every act, creates ripples that can either lift others up or tear them down. Captain Parker's downfall is a cautionary tale. Prejudice, arrogance, and abuse of authority have real consequences. Yet what truly stands out here is the resilience of a mother and daughter who stayed united in the face of ignorance. Their courage, combined with the support of others who wouldn't stay silent, ensured justice prevailed and transformed a moment of cruelty into an opportunity for growth. If this story moved you or taught you something about standing up for what's right, we invite you to be part of our community. Like this video if you believe in fairness. Share it to spread the word about the power of unity, and subscribe to join us on future journeys of hard truths, heartwarming triumphs, and life lessons worth remembering. Stay vigilant, stay hopeful, and keep believing in brighter skies ahead.